Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to the second webinar in a four-part series presented by American Jewish Committee and Tablet Magazine titled 21st Century Europe and the Jews. Over these four programs, AJC and Tablet will explore timely issues related to Jewish life and the protection of democracies in Europe. Today's program will explore Poland and its unique relationship with historical memory. Joining us today to examine this and more are Deputy Director of the Museum of the Second World War in Dansk, Dr. Grzegorz Behrendt, Historian of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe at Tel Aviv University, Dr. Javi Dreyfus, Chief Curator of the Permanent Exhibition at the Polish Museum of the History of Polish Jews, Dr. Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, and AJC Central Europe Acting Director, Dr. Sebastian Rajak. Moderating today's program is Dr. Antony Polonsky, Professor Emeritus of Holocaust Studies at Brandeis University. After we hear from our guests, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may submit your question through the Q&A feature in Zoom. We'll be joined later in today's program by AJC CEO David Harris, who will provide concluding remarks. Dr. Polonsky, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Claire, for that very helpful introduction. In the year 2004, the historian Andrzej Paczkowski wrote, "One of the most significant phenomena in Poland the last 15 years has been the emergence, concretization, also in political life, of competing positions in the sphere of memory and in relation to the national past. This is even more the case today, and it applies not only to questions such as how is one to assess the decision to initiate an uprising in Warsaw in August 1944, or how is one to evaluate the roundtable discussion which led to the negotiated end of communism in Poland in 1989, but also to problems related to the Jewish past in Poland, and in particular, the response of Polish society to the mass murder of Polish Jews initiated and carried out by the German occupiers on Polish soil during the Second World War. The aim of this panel is to attempt to understand why this past has been so disputed in Poland, leading to a serious deterioration in Polish-Israeli and Polish-Jewish relations in recent months. The past cannot be changed. It can only be analyzed and understood. We may disagree about how it is to be interpreted, but our goal today should be to see how far we are able to find common ground. We have a distinguished panel whose members Claire Bailey has introduced. I've posed a series of questions which I've asked them to answer, and I hope this will lead to constructive dialogue. The first question is the question which is posed by this seminar as a whole. What is Polish history? How can it be best defined? Is it the history of the Polish nation, the history of the Polish state, or the history of the different ethnic and religious groups which lived on the Polish lands? I'll take the panelists in alphabetical order, and the first, of course, therefore, is Grzegorz Behrendt. Grzegorz.
Antony, this question is maybe the most difficult among all questions you asked, because it is difficult to say if it's a history of Polish people, history of Polish lands, history written on research in Poland or by Poles or Polish historians all abroad. So frankly saying, I do not know a short and simple answer for your question. The simplest one is that it is a history of Poland carried out in Poland, but it would be a wrong answer, because there is so many people occupied with Polish history all around the world. So frankly saying, I do not know simple answer for your question. All these aspects I take into account.
Yes, thank you. I think all of the above is always a good answer. Javi Dreyfus, could you give your view on this question?
Thank you, Anthony. So as mentioned, I'm an historian of the Jewish people who specialize in Holocaust studies. So I will try to answer from the perspective of Jewish history. As I understand it, it is impossible to understand the history of the Jewish people, and in fact, the development of modern Europe, as well as fundamental human phenomena, without studying Polish history. At the end of the 19th century, close to 90% of the world Jews lived in Eastern Europe, many of them in the Polish territories. In this fair grew movement that fundamentally changed the Jewish world, Hasidism, Jewish nationalism, Jewish socialism, and more. And in fact, they changed much above this Jewish world. So it is in this space that has produced unprecedented creative forces, as well as become the site of the darkest catastrophe of the Jewish people, the Holocaust. So if you want to understand today's Jewry, if you have a desire to learn more about modern Europe, if you wish to delve into human insight, go and study Polish Jewish history. I'm not sure you will find a concrete definition, but you will gain much more.
Well, thank you very much. Myself, if one speaks of one's own career, I started as a historian of Poland between the wars, and I moved from that to Polish-Jewish relations and the history of Jews in Poland. Barbara, can you give your answer?
You are muted.
Mm-hmm. From my point of view, this is a question that has to be answered because the answer becomes the basis for the creating of museums, for the creation of permanent exhibitions, for the writing of history. So I think that it can, on the one hand, be left as a kind of an open, abstract question that is unanswerable, but in fact, it's always being answered because it's the precondition for writing a history of Polish Jews or for exhibiting it or doing anything else with it. So the first thing is I would cite Jacob Gold, the famous statement that there is no history of Poland without a history of Polish Jews. There's no history of Polish Jews without a history of Poland, that they are inextricably linked. That would be the first thing. The second would be that there is more than one way to be Polish, and that history of Polish Jews demonstrates one of the ways of being Polish. The third point I would make is basically a conundrum which has come into focus, I would say, in the modern period, and that is Poland a nation state or is it a state of nations? And clearly, this was a very, very important issue, and it had huge political implications during the interwar years, during the Second Polish Republic, before the death of Pilsudski, after the death of Pilsudski, and certainly in the post-war period, and certainly in our period today. And so it seems to me that one of the, I think, strengths of the core exhibition at Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews is that its starting point is that that the history of Polish Jews is a way to recover the historical diversity of Poland, never better exemplified than during the period of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when half the Jewish population of the world was actually living in the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And that that is actually our starting point. And we see that as in stark contrast with the post-war period. And I would conclude simply by observing that Poland was once one of the most, that is to say, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was once one of the most diverse countries in Europe. Today is one of the most homogeneous. And that Poland was once home to the largest Jewish community in Europe and is today home to the smallest. And that would be my starting point.
Well, thank you again. That's very helpful. Sebastian, this was your question, or at least you pointed out to me its importance of asking it. What's your answer?
Thank you, Anthony. I'll start with the singular and I'll end with the plural. So from a bird's eye view, you may see this history as a history of a people, of a nation, of a territorial group, a group of great aspirations, a great potential, and that group is placed among two mighty neighbors. It defines, it predetermines the political reality of that group, and therefore it strikes for survival, and therefore tends to see itself as a victim of oppression very often. And that experience of oppression and danger dominates its collective psyche so much that it fails to see that it also at times might have been oppressive towards others. So here you have this tension between being an object of oppression and acting in an oppressive way sometimes as well. And that oppression towards others, if not physically, then at least culturally or politically. And by the way, that does not only apply to relationships between Poles as a group on the one hand and other groups on the other, but also to, how should I put it, intra-Polish relations or relations between particular classes, social classes within society, let's say nobility versus peasants, the rural population in general. And then the myth of a hospitable, generous, heroic nation is just that. It's a myth that has to be confronted. And I will end with the plural, as I promised. We should rather be talking about histories of Poland because of the ethnic and religious ingredients that you have and used to have in the past, and because of the many social layers that we can focus on.
Well, thank you. I think that these four responses give us a very useful framework to the whole discussion. Is there anything anybody would like to add before we move on to the next question?
Yes, thank you, Sebastian. I take your point, history versus histories, but not because there are separate groups with separate histories, but because there are different perspectives, different focus, different issues that might produce quite different, quote, histories. And one of the things at Polin Museum that we strove to do was to create an integrated history, an integral and integrated history, rather than to treat the history of Polish Jews as one of many histories of Poland. And I think that that's a very, very productive and a very interesting approach to take. And it had huge implications for the way in which we actually thought about and approached the entire core exhibition.
Well, thank you. I think
I agree.
That's very helpful. Let me now move on to the second of my questions, which is what in your opinion are the most important achievements in Polish historiography since the end of communism in 1989? And here I would just make 2 points. One, I studied in Poland in the 1960s, and the idea that there was no serious history being done then, of course, is not the case. But 1989 did mean the end of any real censorship over historical research, and it also led to a huge expansion of the areas which it was permissible to study. I remember the head of the seminar in modern history at the University of Warsaw, of which I was a part in 1965, Andrzej Garlicki, saying, "A sensible man does not go beyond 1989, he should have said person, does not go beyond 1939. Whereas, of course, much of the research which has taken place since 1989 has been on the Second World War and on the period of the Polish People's Republic, because these archives were now, for the first time, open." So I'll ask Grzegorz first to give his opinion.
Grzegorz, you have to unmute.
Yeah.
I am on. So in my opinion, the most important thing change happened after the collapse of communism is opening of all issues closed until the end of 1989. It is what Professor Poloński mentioned before. And we are now free in Poland to research everything. And first, people after the collapse of communism started to go deep into this issue that were omitted during the communist time. As Garlicki mentioned, don't touch the history after 1st of September 1939. So now we have no such limits, and everything is under research, and different perspectives are presented, different opinions. And what really changed, it was an access to the close collections of documents and sources. And historians in Poland, not only in Poland, but also historians interested in Polish history, can carry out research all over the world, using this material. In my opinion, now after 30 years, we are much farther with everything that during the communist time, taking into account not only the question of the history of Jews in Poland, of Jewish Gentile relations during in Poland from the Middle Ages up to now. In my opinion, everything now in Poland is under research. It is the best change and the best achievement, with a lot of sources of financing this research from the country and from abroad. And we are not able to, in Poland, this is my Polish perspective, when we are now able to travel to Ukraine, to Israel, to Germany, and to make research in local archive using local sources. So this wide perspective and all aspects under research, in my opinion, is the greatest achievement of Polish historiography, or of this Polish history done after 1989.
Well, thank you. Javi, can you give your answer?
Yes, unfortunately, I must admit I deeply disagree with the opinion that we just raised, and I can hardly say that these years can be captured as things that are being opened, and that free research is being encouraged, and that subjects are not omitted. And I will try to answer your question in a different way. Which is actually quite easy. As an Israeli historian, and despite the impressive research done in Israel and the United States, I can say clearly that the most important studies written in the last 3 decades on the topic of the Holocaust of Polish Jews were written in Polish by Polish scholars. Those researchers, Professor Barbara Enkelnicki, Professor Jan Grabowski, Dr. Darik Lebionka, and many others, have in fact redefined Holocaust research time after time. Now, this is a true reason for Polish pride, or rather, I should say, it could have been a true reason for Polish pride. Unfortunately, and we might and should expand on this later, those prominent scholars have been under governmental attacks for several years, an attack which causes direct damage to the impressive achievement of the Polish Academy. So the only aspect I can agree with Professor Berendt is the fact that archives were opened, but I don't see any encouragement of different opinions. It's not even a question of opinions, but we have very thorough research done, which is under today governmental censorship and attacks, and that is the most biggest problem that I see today, and maybe we can elaborate about it later on.
Yes, certainly. This, of course, is also the topic of the next question, and we will obviously come back to it. It's central to our discussion, but I'll ask Barbara to give her opinion now.
So I'll speak from the perspective of the history of Polish Jews, and again, from my experience at Polin Museum. And what I would say is a major achievement in Poland, but also abroad. In other words, I think broadly of Polish history, is a paradigm shift in the study of Polish Jews. And what is the paradigm shift? And that is that until the last 2 or 3 decades, the history of Polish Jews in Poland was not actually, from my point of view, a history of Polish Jews. It was a history of Polish-Jewish relations. And a history of Polish-Jewish relations was largely a history of antisemitism and to some degree assimilation. In other words, it was rather more about Poles than Jews, and it was rather more about Jews as objects on which others project their fantasies and fears. It was not a truly what I would consider to be a history of Polish Jews, which would be a history of basically Jews as agents in their own history and not as objects. And so one of the tasks of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews was, in fact, to bring this paradigm shift to bear on the way in which we would present the history of Polish Jews. And that paradigm shift is really reflected in wonderful new research and also in Jewish studies programs in Wrocław and elsewhere. And I think that it's a tremendous achievement that scholars are now able to work with Jewish sources and not only in Polish archives, that they are able to work in Yiddish, they're able to work in Hebrew, that they're working internationally, they're collaborating with scholars in Israel, the United States, other parts of Europe. And so I see there being really significant achievements in this paradigm shift and what it means to study the history of Polish Jews.
Well, thank you. Again, I'm resisting the temptation to intervene because I don't want to abuse my function as moderator. So I'll ask Sebastian.
Too good. Oh, Anthony, you're just too good.
No, I'll ask Sebastian to give his reaction.
Thank you. I may have some issues with my sound. I keep getting messages that my internet the connection is not stable. I'll try. Just let me know if there's anything.
No,
wrong.
it sounds fine. It sounds fine.
Okay, so for me, the number one thing, it's a more general achievement, not only when we talk about Polish historiography. It's more general, but specifically reflected in Holocaust research. Number one would be Alltagsgeschichte, which is the history of everyday life. We have made a tremendous improvement in learning about how people actually live their lives, and that also holds true for everyday life during the war in the ghettos. There's a lot has been published, a lot is being published. That is also includes what we sometimes call her story, women's history, or women's contribution to history. I think that is very important. Number two would be the history of the downtrodden. And again, Holocaust research is part of that, but it's more generally minorities. How minorities fared in Poland with Poles, among Poles. It also has to do with ethnic Poles who are the underclass. Number three, I will come back to what I mentioned initially, and that's the question of myth. The over the last 20-30 years, Polish historians have been trying, and I am choosing my words carefully, have been trying with ups and downs to confront the myths, history as myths versus history as confrontation. Paul Tillich said, one of his book was titled The Courage to Be, and I would say the courage to be aware of all shades of gray when we talk about history, in particular in history of Poland specifically. So I think that has been that has been a major achievement. It's definitely very difficult when we talk about the history of Polish Jews and Polish-Jewish relations and the Holocaust. And I understand there's always a tension between governmental, maybe not always, but it doesn't look unnatural. Every government, every political power has the ambition to, if not control, at least to moderate what historical debates are about and how they are run. And so I guess this tension will continue to exist. But it's a major achievement of Polish historians trying to overcome that tension.
Well, thank you very much. I think that I'm not going to ask people to comment on what's been said so far, because the next question does raise most of the issues which we've been talking about. I'll just make a couple of points before I pose the question. First is, coming from South Africa, I'm very well aware of the difficulty of overcoming a divisive and painful past and the difficulties which this creates. So I do understand how difficult it is to do this in the Polish context. I would say, secondly, and I would agree with Barbara, that the real progress which has been made in the understanding of the history of Jews on the Polish lands is in the establishment of Jewish life, the nature of Jewish religious civilization on the Polish lands, the development of movements for integration, all aspects of Polish Jewish past up to the Second World War. The Second World War is the crux and the most difficult problem. It reminds me of the joke about the man who was going to Dublin, and he asked somebody on the way, how do I get to Dublin? And the answer was, if I were going to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here. And so this is a very serious problem. And this comes back, and this is the last point that I'll make here, to a point that was made by Andrzej Nowak in the debate about Jan Gross's book, Sąsiedzi, Neighbors. You'll remember that Andrzej Nowak had an article where he posed the question, Jedwabne or Westerplatte? And I think that we need a history which is both about Jedwabne and about Westerplatte, a history which both looks at the dark past, the difficult past, those aspects of the nation's history which cause pain and shame, and Westerplatte, those aspects of the nation's history about which one is justly proud. And obviously, in the case of Poland, as in every country, there are both sides, and we need to find a way to synthesize them. So let me now move on to the third question, which is, I suppose, the central question of what we're looking at today. What are the problems which have occurred in interpreting the past, above all in the area of Polish-Jewish relations? And what role is played in this, as Sebastian pointed out, by the current government's historical policy? So I'll ask Grzegorz to comment on these questions.
So coming back for a minute to earlier questions, I was answering the general question, what in your opinion are the most important achievements of Polish historiography? So I mentioned I focus not on aspects of history of Polish Jews, in Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, or on Jew-Gentile relations. So I gave a general question. In my opinion, what I said, I underline for the second time. We are now in a free country. Quite often, I do not recognize my country, what I can read, what I can find in bookshops, in libraries, in newspapers, in scientific papers during conferences, in commentaries on our country. And as I want to stress that the freedom of research is a fact in Poland, and all aspects of Polish history are being researched. So I do not agree that with the opinion that any aspect, any research is limited by anyone. All institutions, all universities in Poland, all scientific institutes takes money or receive, they receive money from government. All these projects, programs are carried out because of money coming from the government, and it is going on since 30 years. Politicians change, but this situation is the same. The situation is the same. So please do not lose this point in your commentaries. We generally in Poland work because of a great state support coming from the very beginning, with this spreading of focus of topics, issues under research since this 30 years. Nothing has changed. And now the difficult points. In historiography, referring Polish-Jewish relations, or it's better to say Jewish-Gentile relations, because we are talking about Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, also with Ukrainians, Belarusians, with people belonging to Orthodox churches, not only to Roman Catholic Church. So, of course, what could be done and is being done. It is a research of all these tensions that happened in the past. And we know much more now than we used to know 30 years ago. And because of opening of new collections of documents, we learn much more also about the darkest period of the German occupation of the Second World War. What is also important, that in comparison with, for example, 1990s, we have now dozens of historians in Poland who can use Jewish language sources and to use this material, information, to present narrative about what was going on before the Holocaust and also during Holocaust. And we are now talking about what was the scale of collaboration with German occupation forces. What was the behavior? And for example, we can meet such a general opinions that Poles did so or so. But my point is, which Poles, what percentage of Poles or Gentile people, who is responsible, because there were, referring only to the Polish people, Polish Gentile people, there were 22 million people about whom we are talking. Quite often, we can meet a point with general statement that Poles or Polish society did this or that. And we quarrel to some extent about this aspect, the scale, the behavior. And it is one point of a very, very vehement discussion we confront now, because we, my point is to point and to name perpetrators, not to use terms that are close to simplification and generalization. I am against this, as I am against any generalization. It is my point, and I think the most vehement discussions now are connected with what was going on in Poland during German occupation.
We can't hear you.
Before I ask Kavi to respond, in the question, somebody asked what Westerplatte was. So I just should explain that this was part of the port of Danzig, where Polish forces resisted the Germans in a very heroic manner at the beginning of the Second World War. Kavi.
Thank you, Anthony. So first of all, to Sebastian, fighting what is called the pedagogy of shame, the need to protect the so-called the good name of the Polish nation, and the desire to control, or as you said, moderate Holocaust memory are concepts unheard of in free democratic society, and certainly not in the world of academia. When historians are put to trial, when journalists are being called to the police, when the last episode was a movie about Ziegelboim, we cannot talk about free research. And those are things that should be noted. Now, regarding your question, Anthony, I will say that the main problem, and I guess I won't surprise anybody saying it now, the main problem causing ongoing damage is the direct government involvement in academia and the current Polish state's attempt to shape a distorted historical narrative. Poland is not responsible for the Holocaust, despite the fact that it is on its location where many atrocities were held. Nazi Germany performed the Holocaust, there is no question. But Nazi Germany received considerable assistance in the persecution and murder of the Jews across all of Europe, Poland included. Now, on the one hand, the Polish government promotes research and commemoration of Jewish life prior to the Second World War, as Professor Berendt had said, or those who were murdered by the Germans. And this is important. Yet at the same time, it works to block any discussion of cases where Poles were involved in the persecution and the murder of the Jews. And sadly, such cases were not rare and are well documented. Many records and research indicate that although Poland fought heroically against Nazi Germany, not only in Westerplatte, but in many other places, many Poles were willing to assist the occupier in one aspect of its policy, the extermination of the Jews. True, most Polish Jews were murdered by Nazi Germany, but recent research shows that hundreds of thousands lost their life due to direct or indirect Polish involvement. Now, the governmental attempts to distort history are multiple, and I will point out only two phenomena. First of all, expanding and emphasizing cases of Poles who assist Jews, those people who are considered as righteous among the nation. And I will just remind us that most of those noble Poles were forced to hide their courageous actions for fear of revenge attack by their own Polish surroundings. The second phenomena is reducing cases of collaboration. Claims that those who betrayed, reported, or murdered the Jews came from the margin of the society are baseless. Jews were betrayed by underground members, but by those who will become later cursed soldiers, by intelligentsia and rural Poles, and not only by the margin of the society. Largely speaking, according to the documentation we have today and the research we have today, many more Poles were involved in persecuting the Jews than assisting them. Now, attributing the courageous actions of the righteous among the nation to the whole Polish nation, while omitting the much more prevalent acts in which Poles blackmailed, persecuted, enforced upon, and murdered Jews is Holocaust distortion. And that is, in my opinion, the most dangerous problem we face today.
Well, thank you. These are.
I don't agree.
No, I understand. I think we'll discuss this afterwards. I think that the point, two clearly defined positions have been set out. I'll ask Barbara to give her answer now.
Sure. So basically, my starting point is what I understand as the government's historical policy. And it's been very clearly stated, which is to defend the good name of Poland. And in my understanding is that that has been has come to define the mandate of the Institute of National Remembrance, that the research at the Institute for National Remembrance should follow the government's historical policy, which is to defend the good name of Poland. Well, that is not a starting point for solid historical scholarship, simply. I would be really interested in hearing Professor Berendt respond to that, because it has profound implications for the research that is conducted at IPN, and it has profound implications for school curricula, profound implications for museums, for existing museums, the Museum of the Second World War, where I understand that you are now the acting director. It has profound, and I think that the transformations of that museum are in line with state historical policy. And it has been subject to great, I would say, debate, discussion, controversy. It has profound implications also for the creating of new museums, and more of them that are consistent with, quote, defending the good name of Poland. Now, I am completely in agreement with Javi that a great source of pride is in a country's willingness and ability to confront not only what they are rightfully proud of, but also what they are deeply ashamed of. And I'm reminded of a statement by Dariusz Stola, who said that we today, you, me, most of people living in Poland today are not personally responsible for what people before us did, but we are responsible for what we do with that knowledge. That's our responsibility. And to, in a way, to find a way, and I would say a Polish way, a way that's specific to Poland, not a German way, a Polish way to deal with shame in a period where the government policy is all about pride, I think is an enormous challenge for the academy and for cultural institutions. And so I would really be interested in the, what others have to say about this.
Can I answer? Can I comment?
Yes, please.
So first, please, I would be very obliged for mentioning the names of historians of the Institute of National Remembrance occupied with the history of Holocaust, who wrote untrue about the situation in Poland. Please do not general. Please call the names of several historians from the Institute who write something according to the knowledge, to the sources about what was going on during the German occupation of Poland, and the focusing on this, on the issue of Jewish, Gentile, Jewish, Polish relations during this horrible time. So I do not know any historians working in the Institute, in the IPN, who ignored knowledge, information from sources, because we know the same sources in Poland, all carrying out research on this. We know the same sources, and we use them in a way we were taught during our academical studies. And to point the IPN as an institution sharing untrue about the war, about the attitude of Gentile population toward Jewish people is not correct, because I cannot find it in publication. You mentioned several persons suggesting that only they in Poland write truth about what was going on. It is not correct. We have hundreds of books, hundreds of papers and articles published in Poland all the time, with all these aspects you mentioned touched in this book, not only by people from academia or people you mentioned, also by people working in the IPN or any institution. What the IPN awaits from all colleagues is to use sources in such a way that quotations are not changed. For example, if there is in a source, in a testimony, information, who was a perpetrator, blue police, Germans, Jewish police, Judicial Ordnungsdienst, not to remove Germans and Judicial Ordnungsdienst and leaving only blue police. It is a point that now we are in the situation that quite often people trying to present the involvement of Polish people in the Holocaust falsificate sources. And I will never agree. This because I were not taught during my studies to do some things like this. And such things happens now in order to present a strong thesis about Polish involvement in Holocaust. I will never agree with such a point and this practice, never.
Well, time is running out, and I think that we won't have time for the other questions. Grzegorz has made a very strong statement. I'll ask Sebastian to make a statement now as before we close, and then ask Barbara and Javi, but we really have to finish at 10 to 5. So if you can just speak very quickly, Sebastian, Javi.
I'm not going to make a statement. I'm going to offer my perspective on things that have been touched. And to Javi, when I was talking about governments willing to control or have a say in how historical narratives are shaped, I did not say that's okay. I only said that it's to a degree that's natural. And that's, of course, you can talk about differences and the intensity of that. But, well, just look at France and Canada. There are things France only recently, a few decades ago, started to talk openly, including historians, about their World War II history. We are all witnessing how Canada is going through a very difficult process of coming to terms with their very recent and complicated history. So that I think it's unavoidable on the one hand, but that does not mean that historians have to admit that there is a dominant narrative that they have to conform to. And if the question is, do we have scholarly freedom of research in Poland, I think there are at least 2 levels on which you can offer an answer. The most fundamental level is you have basically free access to government resources to fund your research, regardless of the topic, more or less. I'm maybe simplifying a bit. But then the second level is when you publish your research, what's then? What's next? Are there any retortions? And here the picture is not really you cannot paint the picture in rosy colors. We know we're all aware of the 2018 law that does have some freezing effect on historians, specifically young ones who might want to take up difficult topics, but they wouldn't feel safe. That being said, the first case in Poland when a historian was brought to court was back in 2004 also based on the law of the so-called IPN law, which already at that time included, you know, Javi, that provision on Holocaust denial. And that professor was fired. I think he was found guilty, but the crime was described as of lesser gravity. He was fired from his university. That was the first case when historical debate was limited by a state institution, and that was a court.
Sebastian,
Yeah,
Sebastian,
one more sentence, Anthony. I think we should try and keep things in some kind of balance. So there is definitely a tension between what Poland's government would love to see as official history, let's say, and what historians want to do and are doing. But if we generalize, and if we say, because you happen to work for the Institute of National Remembrance, by definition, your research is worthless, or your research is part of government propaganda, then I would not subscribe to that view. Yeah.
you know, this is a very important discussion. I think that we all want to reach some degree of consensus. We all are committed to this research. We are trying to find common ground, but we don't have enough time, and we need
Dr.
more
Polonsky,
time.
please feel free to take a few more minutes just so we can round out our conversation.
Okay, well then I'll just ask Javi and to say a few words, and then Barbara to say a few words.
Okay, so first of all, regarding the EPN, and I think this is what Barbara was trying to say, the fact that the EPN was its tasks were changed by law in the summer of 2018 mean that today the EPN is not only obligated to document what happened and things like that, but it is obligated to protect the good name of the Polish nation. And this is what Barbara was saying. She can elaborate later on. The fact that an institute is forced to protect this good name already puts this institution in a very problematic place. Not to say when it's a governmental institute with such an impact. Second thing, regarding different aspects that are research and not research, I'll give just one example: antisemitism. Much was written in the recent year about general antisemitism and about Nazi antisemitism, but there are some unique characters of antisemitism in Poland, that of Dmowski School and other. Some ideas that were nurtured by the ND and later members of the Delegatura and underground and so on. So there are topics that we can see that are not researched, or at least anyone who will try to research those topics will find himself in a difficult position regarding what the government will try to promote or stop. The last thing, I think that the most interesting question was the one that Anthony, Barbara, and Sebastian, you mentioned, and that is actually, what do democratic countries do with skeletons that they have? Now, each democratic country has its skeletons. And if you're not a democratic country, it's not a problem. You can do whatever you want. But there are different ways that those societies refer to it. You can say that we don't have any skeletons. You can say that those skeletons should be blamed for even being there. You can say that others did it, or many other things. The question is, the critical question, I think, is, as was said by Barbara before, it's not a question of guilt. It's not a question of shame. It's a question of, first of all, responsibility of what we are doing with that past. And today, although there are wonderful Polish researchers, one of their problems is that they have to act in a very problematic atmosphere. And we already see that young scholars in Poland are not working as they did in the past. And that is something that is very, very, very worrying.
Barbara, just want to say—
I do not recognize my country in what you are talking about. I do not know the academia. I do not know my students, which can handle any difficult problem. I simply do not recognize Poland in what you are talking about, my country.
Well, if I can respond, Grzegorz, Professor Berendt, I totally understand what you're saying, and that is to say that I know that you feel and you feel that your students feel that they can basically research anything and they have access to any sources that they want to get to. And I would agree. I don't disagree. So that's not the issue. The issue is that there is an historical policy, and it is to defend the good name of Poland. That is the historical policy, and it is shaping not only the academic world, but it doesn't mean that there aren't independent minds that are working against that policy. There are. Nobody's yet gone to jail because they didn't quote defend the name of Poland. We're not suggesting that for a moment, but it is providing the framework. It is providing a kind of a guide to what is expected, what is respected, and it is that is the historical policy. Where I see it, now you may not see it so clearly in the academy, and that's great, but where I see it is in the cultural sector. I see it in education, I see it in museums, I see it in your museum. I see it also in the way in which Polin Museum has to navigate its own course in trying to deal with difficult issues, whether it's the March 68 exhibition, whether at any number of instances, because the concept of what a museum is, as we've heard from Minister Glinsky, is that people should leave feeling good and that there shouldn't be debate, but there should rather be a kind of consensus, and that museums should not inspire the kind of debates that these difficult issues raise. So I understand it really more from the cultural sector, because I believe that museums play an extremely important role as a bridge between the academy and the public. A very, very, very important role. That's our role. And we have I would say a responsibility to perform that role in a way that we think of as being intellectually independent and not governed by the state's historical policy to defend the good name of Poland, because we believe that the best way to defend the good name of Poland is to be historically honest, bold, and open to debate. That's the way. And I mean, you can perhaps comment from the perspective of your museum.
So, okay. And the debate is going on in Poland, and mentioning the most difficult, tragic aspects we touch now. These issues are so important that nobody will change the situation about discussing, checking, a kind of checking. Sebastian mentioned discussion in Canada, but such discussions take place all over the world where there are difficult, very important issues. So it is what is going on in Poland now. There is a kind of presentation of information and opinion, and other historians are coming and checking, is it okay? Are we to accept, to adopt it or not? And it is the situation in Poland now. Issues and information and opinions confirmed are accepted, that not confirmed are not accepted. It is what is going on. And coming to the Museum of the Second World War, during the last 4 years, there were some information, 27 information points added to the permanent exhibitions. Added, not removed from the exhibition, from permanent exhibition. And,
excuse me, what about the final? What about the final film? What about the final film? What happened?
Yes,
you moved the final film. You replaced it with a patriotic one,
final film
and they were forced to reverse.
Was removed. Yes, and it was decision of the former director.
Why? Why?
Why? Well, because he didn't find it correct to put together the information about terrorism, Islamic terrorism, and on the second screen, the picture of John Paul II. So it was his right to make such a
That's absolutely
such
his
a-
right,
to
no
take such
question.
decision.
This is a very important
Was his
discussion, and
decision.
I'd like to, with great regret, I think we do need to bring it to a close. I'd like to thank all the 4 participants for expressing their views so openly and for listening to each other. I think that the first thing that we need to do is to listen. And I think that we do need to try and find a consensus. And the consensus is based on the need to understand this very painful and very difficult past. I'll stop there and I'll hand over to David
We
Harris.
perhaps need a second part of this discussion.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. The trouble is, we had 40 minutes, we were extended to 50, we had 50 minutes, we were extended to an hour. This is only a start, but I think that we all need to work together because this is something which is crucial for the future of Poland, something to a country to which we are all devoted and whose happy future we all look to. But I'll hand over to David Harris, CEO of the AJC, to round up this evening's discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Polonsky, and thank you to our panel for an extraordinarily stimulating and challenging conversation. I originally had comments prepared to wrap this up, but I've now deleted those comments in the interest of the shortage of time. I simply want to say that I myself am not a scholar of this issue. I am, however, for the last 40 years, a practitioner in the field of relations between Poland and the Jewish people. And Sebastian, my AJC colleague, if there is a second opportunity, I'll be happy to share my own experiences. I will conclude only by saying this, as was said earlier, why does the American Jewish Committee continue to engage in these extraordinarily difficult issues, this kind of political and intellectual minefield that we've seen yet again? Because there is no Jewish history without Poland, and there is no Polish history without the Jewish people. And 40 years ago, I heard similar discussions and debates and differences. 40 years later, again, those differences are revealed. But as Professor Polonsky, as you said, we are in a way bound to continue this conversation in an effort to see where we can advance the conversation and not simply dig in order to paralyze the conversation. There are painful truths, there are competing narratives. We at AJC are prepared to continue. We're proud to partner with the Tablet magazine, and we thank all of the panelists for being so forthright in this discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you, David, and thank you to our esteemed guests and moderator for today's incredible conversation. And thank you to our global audience for tuning in today. Don't miss the next of our series on November 18th, titled, Is France Being Torn Apart? Register for this program and more at ajc.org/advocacy anywhere. Thank you again and goodbye.